So on the day that we celebrate Transfiguration in the church year, we mark that moment as we move from Epiphany, which this reading always sounds like Epiphany to me, right? Or at least when we think about Epiphanies, into that of Lent. We mark it by hearing the story of Jesus on the mountain, pulled deeply into what is an otherworldly experience. A story gospel authors sought to connect to these moments of divine intercession in the story of the early Israelite community in Exodus. These stories are reminders for us of the need to integrate the supernatural, the otherworldly, the mythical, the imaginative part of ourselves with the down-to-earth brass tacks of daily living and surviving. It's a big task, but then it is just as big a task to live aware of divinity in each single day. Even in the midst of the most awe-inducing experience of our lives, we must keep an eye tuned to the mundane habits, the needs of our bodies in the moment. This is what can be obscured from our thoughts when we hear these experiences of awe. What was it like to live in a human, frail body in a moment of overwhelming connection to God? Peter often gets a bad rap for offering to make dwelling spaces instead of living into the awe of his moment. But maybe he has a point, too. Confronted by awesome divine attention, the disciples, the people of Exodus, have to find ways to exist in that space. Our reading from Exodus comes as we jump into the story after a moment of shocking divine revelation to 70-plus elites of Israel on that mountaintop. These elders got to experience God. The text says that they saw God. But then, out of that moment, Moses is called to travel further, to get closer, and they are sent back down to the people, with Aaron and Hur to help them, but most significantly, to wait. To come that close and then have to sit and wait must have been unbearably significant. Moses continues up the mountain, centers himself within cloud cover for more than a month. Into that devouring fire he goes, leaving his community in what he hopes are good hands. Moses is a person with deep conviction, deep and abiding trust, who knows his place in the system and is accepting his work willingly within it. Certainly, he is known to have pushed back against God's plan for his life, but in this moment we hear no shock or fear of following. Here he just says yes and goes into that cloud. When confronted with changing times, author, pastor Todd Bolsinger says you have to start with conviction, stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course. In this moment, we could certainly say that is true of Moses. The awe of the moment might not be lost on him, but it is certainly not highlighted in the text that we read. It's business as usual. For us, however, we can sit in the astonishment, knowing that getting down to business will happen later. I must believe that Moses was centered enough to know that his experience is a time for wonder, but I can also see the balance of professionalism in this passage, too. It's the kind of personality who can push the emotions away out of the moment just to get through. And as someone who lives that way, it's important to remember that the guards have to come down sometime, too. Wonder and shock and supernatural moments of divine entry into our lives sometimes remind us that we have to make time for the something else of life. It can't all be mundane, nor can it all be creation awesome. This past week, a clergy colleague of mine died from a short but intense cancer battle. We have known it was coming. In fact, his wife was incredibly willing to share their journey through a Carin bridge site they set up earlier. And while I am glad to have known him, my time here in Pennsylvania was obviously shorter than most of my colleagues. Richard and I were in a poetry group started in the early days of COVID lockdowns through Zoom. And so throughout his struggle, many of the group have turned their minds to poetry and coming to terms with the end of his life. One pastor sent out this poem by Malcolm, I think it's Geit, on the Transfiguration when thinking about our friend and colleague and this time of year and this time that is no longer in this time and he who will always be outside of time. The poem is this: for that one moment in and out of time, on that one mountain where all moments meet, the daily veil that covers the sublime in darkling glass fell dazzled at his feet. There were no angels full of eyes and wings, just living glory full of truth and grace. The love that dances at the heart of things shone out from upon us from a human face. And to that light, the light in us leaped up. We felt it quicken somewhere deep within. A sudden blaze of long extinguished hope trembled and tingled through the tender skin. Nor can this blackened sky, this darkened scar, eclipse that glimpse of how things really are. There's a feeling of mundane mixed with the shockingly new that I hear in this version of the story that I can only hope that we all might feel when we come to the fragile, liminal space of life. In death and in life, the moment is fragile. The ecosystems of human communities, as well as the ecology of creation, is both in and out of time. They are both living glory full of truth and grace, the love that dances at the heart of things. And maybe that's what's being highlighted here in these scriptural notes of the moments of fragile life. It's possibly no coincidence that Moses waits 6 days on that mountain and is called by God to come close on the 7th day. In the 7 days of the creation story, work happens until it's time to rest. Maybe God's work was happening in those 6 days before Moses goes into the cloud. God's work of creation in the waiting Moses' heart, in the impatient Israelite community, even in our own fast-tracked existences. The waiting is where we can be changed. The work is where we are changed too, when we see our fingers tracing God's designs for goodness and love. A sudden blaze of long extinguished hope trembled and tingled through the tender skin, the poem says. On the mountaintop, in the plateaus, in the valleys of life, God remains near to us, the love that dances at the heart of things. When Moses and the people have their mountaintop experience, when the disciples share their up-top space with Jesus and revel in the closeness to God, they're all finding themselves connected to a much wider network than they might have imagined. Author Evan Eisenberg wrote about how the character of the mountain itself affects what we understand about these readings for today. In Near East mythology, the concept of the world mountain connects the people to much more than just a high place. For the people of Cana on the edge of the Dead Sea, the lowest point, a mountain clearly would have been amazingly high. He writes, there are certain places on earth that play a central role in the flow of energy, the cycling of water and nutrients. Such places provide many of the services that keep the ecosystems around them and the biosphere as a whole more or less healthy for humans and other life forms. They help control flooding and soil erosion. They provide fresh infusions of pollinating birds and insects. They regulate the mix of oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and other ingredients in the air and keep its temperature within bounds. They are spigots for the circulation of wildness through places made hard and almost impermeable by long human use. All such places are more or less wild. Many are forested, and from them great rivers flow. These moments on the mountain top, these moments where the space between life and death are the places through which God's wildness is circulated through the world. Think on that for a moment. There is something different that happens to us when we center on God's presence, because they are divine moments to create new energy, new networks, to feel worldly renewal. Through our lives, God is renewing the world, as God has done since the origin moments of spark and chemical reactions. And in each encounter, we open the spigots of that creative power again. For Moses, there was work to be done, and yet God was there in the work. For the disciples, refocusing was needed, and God was there in the work. For us, no matter where we are emotionally, mentally, and physically today, God is there in the emotion, the mental exhaustion or joy, the physical presence we're seeking and crave today. To be the light that leaped up in us. Transfiguration brings us to that space between times. That space where we are looking for what's next while not wanting to let go of what we are now. So into this moment, we pour our lives, we take a second, we take a moment, we take 40 days to breathe in, to know that you are loved, to know that God is with you on the journey, and to know that this life we live together is so wonderfully awesome and completely scary, and yet it will always be beautiful anyway. Amen.